Chapter 51, Part 3 of the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dick Durrett. Chapter 51, Conquests by the Arabs, Part 3. One of the 15 provinces of Syria, the cultivated lands to the eastward of the Jordan, had been decorated by Roman vanity with the name of Arabia, and the first arms of the Saracens were justified by the semblance of a national right. The country was enriched by the various benefits of trade. By the vigilance of the emperors, it was covered with a line of forts, and the populous cities of Gerasa, Philadelphia, and Basra were secure, at least, from a surprise by the solid structure of their walls. The last of these cities was the 18th station from Medina. The road was familiar to the caravans of Hejaz and Iraq, who annually visited this plenteous market of the province and the desert. The perpetual jealousy of the Arabs had trained the inhabitants to arms, and 12,000 horses could sally from the gates of Basra, an appellation which signifies in the Syriac language a strong tower of defense. Encouraged by their first success against the open towns and flying parties of the borders, a detachment of 4,000 Moslems presumed to summon and attack the fortress of Basra. They were oppressed by the numbers of the Syrians. They were saved by the presence of Khalid with 1,500 horses. He blamed the enterprise, restored the battle, and rescued his friend, the venerable Serjabil, who had vainly invoked the unity of God and the promises of the apostle. After a short repose, the Moslems performed their ablutions with sand instead of water, and a morning prayer was recited by Khalid before they mounted on horseback. Confident in their strength, the people of Basra threw open their gates, drew their forces into the plain, and swore to die in the defense of their religion. But a religion of peace was incapable of withstanding the fanatic cry of "Fight, fight, paradise, paradise," that re-echoed in the ranks of the Saracens, and the uproar of the town, the ringing of the bells, and the exclamations of the priests and monks increased the dismay and disorder of the Christians. With the loss of 230 men, the Arabs remained masters of the field, and the ramparts of Basra, in expectation of human or divine aid, were crowded with holy crosses and consecrated banners. The governor Romanus had recommended an early submission. Despised by the people and degraded from his office, he still retained the desire and opportunity of revenge. In a nocturnal interview, he informed the enemy of a subterraneous passage from his house under the wall of the city. The son of the Caliph, with 100 volunteers, were committed to the faith of this new ally, and their successful intrepidity gave an easy entrance to their companions. After Khalid had imposed the terms of servitude and tribute, the apostate or convert avowed in the assembly of the people his meritorious treason. "I renounce your society," said Romanus, "both in this world and the world to come. And I deny him that was crucified, and whosoever worships him, and I choose God for my Lord, Islam for my faith, Mecca for my temple, the Moslems for my brethren, and Mohammed for my prophet, who was sent to lead us into the right way and to exalt the true religion in spite of those who join partners with God. The conquest of Basra, 4 days' journey from Damascus, encouraged the Arabs to besiege the ancient capital of Syria. At some distance from the walls, they encamped among the groves and fountains of that delicious territory, and the usual option of the Mohammedan faith, of tribute or of war, was proposed to the resolute citizens who had been lately strengthened by a reinforcement of 5,000 Greeks. In the decline, as in the infancy, of the military art, a hostile defiance was frequently offered and accepted by the generals themselves. Many a lance was shivered in the plain of Damascus, and the personal prowess of Khalid was signalized in the first sally of the besieged. After an obstinate combat, he had overthrown and made prisoner one of the Christian leaders, a stout and worthy antagonist. He instantly mounted a fresh horse, the gift of the governor of Palmyra, and pushed forward to the front of the battle. "Repose yourself for a moment," said his friend Derar, "and permit me to supply your place. You are fatigued with fighting with this dog." "Oh dear," replied the indefatigable Saracen, "we shall rest in the world to come. He that labours today shall rest tomorrow." With the same unabated ardour, Khalid answered, encountered, and vanquished a second champion, and the heads of his 2 captives, who refused to abandon their religion, were indignantly hurled into the midst of the city. The event of some general and partial actions reduced the Damascenes to a closer defence; but a messenger, whom they dropped from the walls, returned with a promise of speedy and powerful succor, and their tumultuous joy conveyed the intelligence to the camp of the Arabs. After some debate, it was resolved by the generals to raise, or rather to suspend, the siege of Damascus till they had given battle to the forces of the emperor. In the retreat, Khalid would have chosen the more perilous station of the rear guard. He modestly yielded to the wishes of Abu Obeidah, but in the hour of danger he flew to the rescue of his companion, who was rudely pressed by a sally of 6,000 horses and 10,000 foot, and few among the Christians could relate at Damascus the circumstances of their defeat. The importance of the contest required the junction of the Saracens, who were dispersed on the frontiers of Syria and Palestine, and I shall transcribe one of the circular mandates which was addressed to Amru, the future conqueror of Egypt. "In the name of the most merciful God, from Khalid to Amru, health and happiness. Know that thy brethren, the Moslems, design to march to Aznadin, where there is an army of 70,000 Greeks, who purpose to come against us, that they may extinguish the light of God with their mouths, but God persevereth his light in spite of the infidels. As soon, therefore, as this letter of mine shall be delivered to thy hands, come with those that are with thee to Aznadin, where thou shalt find us, if it please the Most High God." The summons was cheerfully obeyed, and the 45,000 Moslems who met on the same day, on the same spot, ascribed to the blessing of Providence the effects of their activity and zeal. About 4 years after the triumph of the Persian war, The repose of Heraclius and the empire was again disturbed by a new enemy, the power of whose religion was more strongly felt than it was clearly understood by the Christians of the East. In his palace of Constantinople or Antioch, he was awakened by the invasion of Syria, the loss of Basra, and the danger of Damascus. An army of 70,000 veterans, or new levies, was assembled at Hems and Emissa, under the command of his general Werdan; and these troops, consisting chiefly of cavalry, might be indifferently styled either Syrians, or Greeks, or Romans: Syrians from the place of their birth or warfare, Greeks from the religion and language of their sovereign, and Romans from the proud appellation which was still profaned by the successors of Constantine. On the plain of Aznadin, as Werdan rode on a white mule decorated with gold chains and surrounded with ensigns and standards, he was surprised by the near approach of a fierce and naked warrior who had undertaken to view the state of the enemy. The adventurous valor of Derar was inspired, and has perhaps been adorned by the enthusiasm of his age and country. The hatred of the Christians, the love of spoil, and the contempt of danger were the ruling passions of the audacious Saracen, and the prospect of instant death could never shake his religious confidence, or ruffle the calmness of his resolution, or even suspend the frank and martial pleasantry of his humor. In the most hopeless enterprises he was bold and prudent and fortunate. After innumerable hazards, after being thrice a prisoner in the hands of the infidels, he still survived to relate the achievements and to enjoy the rewards of the Syrian conquest. On this occasion his single lance maintained a flying fight against 30 Romans, who were detached by Werdan, and after killing or unhorsing 17 of their number, Derar returned in safety to his applauding brethren. When his rashness was mildly censured by the general, he excused himself with the simplicity of a soldier. "Nay," said Derar, "I did not begin first, but they came out to take me, and I was afraid that God should see me turn my back, and indeed I fought in good earnest, and without doubt God assisted me against them, and had I not been apprehensive of disobeying your orders, I should not have come away as I did, and I perceive already that they will fall into our hands." In the presence of both armies, a venerable Greek advanced from the ranks with a liberal offer of peace, and the departure of the Saracens would have been purchased by a gift to each soldier of a turban, a robe, and a piece of gold, 10 robes and 100 pieces to their leader, 100 robes and 1,000 pieces to the Caliph. A smile of indignation expressed the refusal of Khaled. "Ye Christian dogs, you know your option: the Koran, the tribute, or the sword. We are a people whose delight is in war rather than in peace, and we despise your pitiful arms, since we shall be speedily masters of your wealth, your families, and your persons." Notwithstanding this apparent disdain, he was deeply conscious of the public danger. Those who had been in Persia, and had seen the armies of Chosroes, confessed that they never beheld a more formidable array. From the superiority of the enemy, the artful Saracen derived a fresh incentive of courage. You see before you," said he, "the united force of the Romans. You cannot hope to escape, but you may conquer Syria in a single day. The event depends on your discipline and patience. Reserve yourselves till the evening." It was in the evening that the prophet was accustomed to vanquish. During 2 successive engagements, his temperate firmness sustained the darts of the enemy, and the murmurs of his troops. At length, when the spirits and quivers of the adverse line were almost exhausted, Caled gave the signal of onset and victory. The remains of the Imperial army fled to Antioch, or Caesarea, or Damascus, and the death of 470 Moslems was compensated by the opinion that they had sent to hell above 50,000 of the infidels. The spoil was inestimable: many banners and crosses of gold and silver, precious stones, silver and gold chains, and innumerable suits of the richest armor and apparel. The general distribution was postponed till Damascus should be taken, but the seasonable supply of arms became the instrument of new victories. The glorious intelligence was transmitted to the throne of the Caliph, and the Arabian tribes, the coldest or most hostile to the Prophet's mission, were eager and importunate to share the harvest of Syria. The sad tidings were carried to Damascus by the speed of grief and terror, and the inhabitants beheld from their walls the return of the heroes of Aiznadin. Amru led the van at the head of 9,000 horse. The bands of the Saracens succeeded each other in formidable review, and the rear was closed by Caled in person, with a standard of the Black Eagle. To the activity of Derar he entrusted the commission of patrolling around the city with 2,000 horse, of scouring the plain, and of intercepting all succor or intelligence. The rest of the Arabian chiefs were fixed in their respective stations before the 7 gates of Damascus, and the siege was renewed with fresh vigor and confidence. The art, the labor, and the military engines of the Greeks and Romans are seldom to be found in the simple though successful operations of the Saracens. It was sufficient for them to invest a city with arms rather than with trenches, to repel the allies of the besieged, to attempt a stratagem or an assault, or to expect the progress of famine and discontent. Damascus would have acquiesced in the trial of Aiznadin as a final and peremptory sentence between the emperor and the caliph. Her courage was rekindled by the example and authority of Thomas, a noble Greek, illustrious in a private condition with the alliance of Heraclius. The tumult and illumination of the night proclaimed the design of the morning sally, and the Christian hero, who affected to despise the enthusiasm of the Arabs, employed the resource of a singular superstition. At the principal gate, in the sight of both armies, a lofty crucifix was erected. The bishop, with his clergy, accompanied the march, and laid the volume of the New Testament before the image of Jesus, and the contending parties were scandalized or edified by a prayer that the Son of God would defend his servants and vindicate his truth. The battle raged with incessant fury, and the dexterity of Thomas, an incomparable archer, was fatal to the boldest Saracens, till their death was revenged by a female heroine. The wife of Aban, who had followed him to the holy war, embraced her expiring husband. "Happy," said she, "happy art thou, my dear! Thou art gone to thy Lord, who first joined us together, and then parted us asunder. I will revenge thy death, and endeavour to the utmost of my power to come to the place where thou art, because I love thee. Henceforth shall no man ever touch me more, for I have dedicated myself to the service of God." Without a groan, without a tear, she washed the corpse of her husband, and buried him with the usual rites. Then, grasping the manly weapons which in her native land she was accustomed to wield, the intrepid widow of Aban sought the place where his murderer fought in the thickest of the battle. Her first arrow pierced the hand of his standard bearer, her second wounded Thomas in the eye, and the fainting Christians no longer beheld their ensign or their leader. Yet the generous champion of Damascus refused to withdraw to his palace. His wound was dressed on the rampart. The fight was continued till the evening, and the Syrians rested on their arms. In the silence of the night, the signal was given by a stroke on the great bell. The gates were thrown open, and each gate discharged an impetuous column on the sleeping camp of the Saracens. Caled was the first in arms. At the head of 400 horse, he flew to the post of danger, and the tears trickled down his iron cheeks as he uttered a fervent ejaculation: "O God, who never sleepest, look upon thy servants, and do not deliver them into the hands of their enemies." The valor and victory of Thomas were arrested by the presence of the sword of God. With a knowledge of the peril, the Moslems recovered their ranks and charged the assailants in the flank and rear. After the loss of thousands, the Christian general retreated with a sigh of despair, and the pursuit of the Saracens was checked by the military engines of the rampart. After a siege of 70 days, the patience and perhaps the provisions of the Damascenes were exhausted, and the bravest of their chiefs submitted to the hard dictates of necessity. In the occurrences of peace and war, they had been taught to dread the fierceness of Caled, and to revere the mild virtues of Abu Obeidah. At the hour of midnight, 100 chosen deputies of the clergy and people were introduced to the tent of that venerable commander. He received and dismissed them with courtesy. They returned with a written agreement on the faith of a companion of Mohammed that all hostilities should cease, that the voluntary immigrants might depart in safety with as much as they could carry of their effects, and that the tributary subjects of the Caliph should enjoy their lands and houses, with the use and possession of 7 churches. On these terms, the most respectable hostages, and the gate nearest to his camp, were delivered into his hands. His soldiers imitated the moderation of their chief, and he enjoyed the submissive gratitude of a people whom he had rescued from destruction. But the success of the treaty had relaxed their vigilance, and in the same moment the opposite quarter of the city was betrayed and taken by assault. A party of 100 Arabs had opened the eastern gate to a more inexorable foe. "No quarter!" cried the rapacious and sanguinary Caled. "No quarter to the enemies of the Lord!" His trumpet sounded, and a torrent of Christian blood was poured down the streets of Damascus. When he reached the church of St. Mary, he was astonished and provoked by the peaceful aspect of his companions. Their swords were in the scabbard, and they were surrounded by a multitude of priests and monks. Abu Obeidah saluted the general. "God," said he, "has delivered the city into my hands by way of surrender, and has saved the believers the trouble of fighting." "And am I not," replied the indignant Caled, "am I not the lieutenant of the commander of the faithful? Have I not taken the city by storm? The unbelievers shall perish by the sword. Fall on!" The hungry and cruel Arabs would have obeyed the welcome command, and Damascus was lost, if the benevolence of Abu Obeidah had not been supported by decent and dignified firmness. Throwing himself between the trembling citizens and the most eager of the barbarians, he adjured them, by the holy name of God, to respect his promise to suspend their fury, and to wait the determination of their chiefs. The chiefs retired into the church of St. Mary, and after a vehement debate, Caled submitted in some measure to the reason and authority of his colleague, who urged the sanctity of a covenant, the advantage as well as the honor which the Moslems would derive from the punctual performance of their word, and the obstinate resistance which they must encounter from the distrust and despair of the rest of the Syrian cities. It was agreed that the sword should be sheathed, that the part of Damascus which had surrendered to Abu Obadiah should be immediately entitled to the benefit of his capitulation, and that the final decision should be referred to the justice and wisdom of the Caliph. A large majority of the people accepted the terms of toleration and tribute, and Damascus is still peopled by 20,000 Christians. But the valiant Thomas and the freeborn patriots who had fought under his banner embraced the alternative of poverty and exile. In the adjacent meadow a numerous encampment was formed of priests and laymen, of soldiers and citizens, of women and children. They collected with haste and terror their most precious movables, and abandoned with loud lamentations or silent anguish their native homes and the pleasant banks of the Pharpar. The inflexible soul of Caled was not touched by the spectacle of their distress. He disputed with the Damascenes the property of a magazine of corn, endeavored to exclude the garrison from the benefit of the treaty, consented with reluctance that each of the fugitives should arm himself with a sword or a lance or a bow, and sternly declared that after a respite of 3 days they might be pursued and treated as the enemies of the Moslems. The passion of a Syrian youth completed the ruin of the exiles of Damascus. A nobleman of the city, of the name of Jonas, was betrothed to a wealthy maiden, but her parents delayed the consummation of his nuptials, and their daughter was persuaded to escape with the man whom she had chosen. They corrupted the nightly watchman of the gate Kaisan. The lover who led the way was encompassed by a squadron of Arabs, but his exclamation in the Greek tongue, "The bird is taken," admonished his mistress to hasten her return. In the presence of Caled and of death, the unfortunate Jonas professed his belief in one God and his apostle Mohammed, and continued till the season of his martyrdom to discharge the duties of a brave and sincere Mussulman. When the city was taken, he flew to the monastery where Eudocia had taken refuge, but the lover was forgotten, the apostate was scorned, she preferred her religion to her country and the justice of Caled, though deaf to mercy, refused to detain by force a male or female inhabitant of Damascus. 4 days was the general confined to the city by the obligation of the treaty and the urgent cares of his new conquest. His appetite for blood and rapine would have been extinguished by the hopeless computation of time and distance, but he listened to the importunities of Jonas, who assured him that the weary fugitives might yet be overtaken. At the head of 4,000 horse, in the disguise of Christian Arabs, Caled undertook the pursuit. They halted only for the moments of prayer, and their guide had a perfect knowledge of the country. For a long way the footsteps of the Damascenes were plain and conspicuous; they vanished on a sudden, but the Saracens were comforted by the assurance that the caravan had turned aside into the mountains and must speedily fall into their hands. In traversing the ridges of the Libanus, they endured intolerable hardships, and the sinking spirits of the veteran fanatics were supported and cheered by the unconquerable ardor of a lover. From a peasant of the country, they were informed that the emperor had sent orders to the colony of exiles to pursue without delay the road of the sea-coast and of Constantinople, apprehensive, perhaps, that the soldiers and people of Antioch might be discouraged by the sight and the story of their sufferings. The Saracens were conducted through the territories of Gabala and Laodicea, at a cautious distance from the walls of the cities. The rain was incessant, the night was dark, a single mountain separated them from the Roman army, and Caled, ever anxious for the safety of his brethren, whispered an ominous dream in the ear of his companion. With the dawn of day the prospect again cleared, and they saw before them in a pleasant valley the tents of Damascus. After a short interval of repose and prayer, Caled divided his cavalry into 4 squadrons, committing the first to his faithful Dirah, and reserving the last for himself. They successively rushed on the promiscuous multitude, insufficiently provided with arms, and already vanquished by sorrow and fatigue. Except a captive who was pardoned and dismissed, the Arabs enjoyed the satisfaction of believing that not a Christian of either sex escaped the edge of their scimitars. The gold and silver of Damascus was scattered over the camp, and a royal wardrobe of 300 load of silk might clothe an army of naked barbarians. In the tumult of the battle, Jonas sought and found the object of his pursuit, but her resentment was inflamed by the last act of his perfidy, and as Eudocia struggled in his hateful embraces, she struck a dagger to her heart. Another female, the widow of Thomas, and the real or supposed daughter of Heraclius, was spared and released without a ransom. But the generosity of Caled was the effect of his contempt, and the haughty Saracen insulted, by a message of defiance, the throne of the Caesars. Caled had penetrated above 150 miles into the heart of the Roman province. He returned to Damascus with the same secrecy and speed. On the accession of Omar, the sword of God was removed from the command, but the Caliph, who blamed the rashness, was compelled to applaud the vigor and conduct of the enterprise. End of chapter 51, part 3. Recording by Dick Durrett, Manchester, New Hampshire, USA.
51, Part 4 of the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, Volume 5, Chapter 51, Part 4. Another expedition of the conquerors of Damascus will equally display their avidity, and their contempt for the riches of the present world. They were informed that the produce and manufactures of the country were annually collected in the fair of Abyla, about 30 miles from the city; that the cell of a devout hermit was visited at the same time by a multitude of pilgrims; and that the festival of trade and superstition would be ennobled by the nuptials of the daughter of the governor of Tripoli. Abdallah, son of Jaffar, a glorious and holy martyr, undertook, with a banner of 500 horse, the pious and profitable commission of despoiling the infidels. As he approached the fair of Abyla, he was astonished by the report of this mighty concourse of Jews and Christians, Greeks and Armenians, of natives of Syria and of strangers of Egypt, to the number of 10,000, besides a guard of 5,000 horse that attended the person of the bride. The Saracens paused. "For my own part," said Abdallah, "I dare not go back. Our foes are many, our danger is great, but our reward is splendid and secure, either in this life or in the life to come. Let every man, according to his inclination, advance or retire." Not a Mussulman deserted his standard. "Lead the way," said Abdallah to his Christian guide, "and you shall see what the companions of the Prophet can perform." They charged in 5 squadrons, but after the first advantage of the surprise, they were encompassed and almost overwhelmed by the multitude of their enemies, and their valiant band is fancifully compared to a white spot in the skin of a black camel. About the hour of sunset, when their weapons dropped from their hands, when they panted on the verge of eternity, they discovered an approaching cloud of dust, they heard the welcome sound of the tekbir, and they soon perceived the standard of Khalid, who flew to their relief with the utmost speed of his cavalry. The Christians were broken by his attack, and slaughtered in their flight, as far as the river of Tripoli. They left behind them the various riches of the fair, the merchandises that were exposed for sale, the money that was brought for purchase, the gay decorations of the nuptials, and the governor's daughter, with 40 of her female attendants. The fruits, provisions, and furniture, the money, plate, and jewels, were diligently laden on the backs of horses, asses, and mules, and the holy robbers returned in triumph to Damascus. The hermit, after a short and angry controversy with Khalid, declined the crown of martyrdom, and was left alive in the solitary scene of blood and devastation. End of chapter 51, part 4. Part 5 of the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, Volume 5, Chapter 51, Part 5. Syria, one of the countries that have been improved by the most early cultivation, is not unworthy of the preference. The heat of the climate is tempered by the vicinity of the sea and mountains, by the plenty of wood and water, and the produce of a fertile soil affords the subsistence, and encourages the propagation, of men and animals. From the age of David to that of Heraclius, the country was overspread with ancient and flourishing cities. The inhabitants were numerous and wealthy, and after the slow ravage of despotism and superstition, after the recent calamities of the Persian war, Syria could still attract and reward the rapacious tribes of the desert. A plain, of 10 days' journey, from Damascus to Aleppo and Antioch, is watered on the western side by the winding course of the Orontes. The hills of Libanus and Anti-Libanus are planted from north to south, between the Orontes and the Mediterranean, and the epithet of hollow, Clesyria, was applied to a long and fruitful valley, which is confined in the same direction, by the 2 ridges of snowy mountains. Among the cities, which are enumerated by Greek and Oriental names in the Geography and Conquest of Syria, we may distinguish Emesa or Hemis, Heliopolis or Baalbek, the former as the metropolis of the plain, the latter as the capital of the valley. Under the last of the Caesars, they were strong and populous; the turrets glittered from afar, an ample space was covered with public and private buildings, and the citizens were illustrious by their spirit, or at least by their pride, by their riches, or at least by their luxury. In the days of paganism, both Emesa and Heliopolis were addicted to the worship of Baal, or the sun, but the decline of their superstition and splendor has been marked by a singular variety of fortune. Not a vestige remains of the temple of Emesa, which was equalled in poetic style to the summits of Mount Libanus, while the ruins of Baalbek, invisible to the writers of antiquity, excite the curiosity and wonder of the European traveller. The measure of the temple is 200 feet in length, and 100 in breadth. The front is adorned with a double portico of 8 columns; 14 may be counted on either side, and each column, 45 feet in height, is composed of 3 massy blocks of stone or marble. The proportions and ornaments of the Corinthian order express the architecture of the Greeks, but as Baalbek has never been the seat of a monarch, we are at a loss to conceive how the expense of these magnificent structures could be supplied by private or municipal liberality. From the conquest of Damascus the Saracens proceeded to Heliopolis and Emesa, but I shall decline the repetition of the sallies and combats which have been already shown on a larger scale. In the prosecution of the war, their policy was not less effectual than their sword. By short and separate truces they dissolved the unity of the enemy, accustomed the Syrians to compare their friendship with their enmity, familiarized the idea of their language, religion, and manners, and exhausted, by clandestine purchase, the magazines and arsenals of the cities which they returned to besiege. They aggravated the ransom of the more wealthy, or the more obstinate, and Chalcis alone was taxed at 5,000 ounces of gold, 5,000 ounces of silver, 2,000 robes of silk, and as many figs and olives as would load 5,000 asses. But the terms of truce or capitulation were faithfully observed, and the lieutenant of the Caliph, who had promised not to enter the walls of the captive Baalbek, remained tranquil and immovable in his tent till the jarring factions solicited the interposition of a foreign master. The conquest of the plain and valley of Syria was achieved in less than 2 years. Yet the commander of the faithful reproved the slowness of their progress, and the Saracens, bewailing their fault with tears of rage and repentance, called aloud on their chiefs to lead them forth to fight the battles of the Lord. In a recent action, under the walls of Emesa, an Arabian youth, the cousin of Khalid, was heard aloud to exclaim, "Methinks I see the black-eyed girls looking upon me, one of whom, should she appear in this world, all mankind would die for love of her. And I see in the hand of one of them a handkerchief of green silk, and a cap of precious stones, and she beckons me, and calls out, 'Come hither quickly, for I love thee.'" With these words, charging the Christians, he made havoc wherever he went, till, observed at length by the governor of Hems, he was struck through with a javelin. It was incumbent on the Saracens to exert the full powers of their valour and enthusiasm against the forces of the emperor, who was taught, by repeated losses, that the rovers of the desert had undertaken, and would speedily achieve, a regular and permanent conquest. From the provinces of Europe and Asia, 80,000 soldiers were transported by sea and land to Antioch and Caesarea. The light troops of the army consisted of 60,000 Christian Arabs of the tribe of Ghassan. Under the banner of Jabalah, the last of their princes, they marched in the van; and it was a maxim of the Greeks, that for the purpose of cutting diamond, a diamond was the most effectual. Heraclius withheld his person from the dangers of the field, but his presumption, or perhaps his despondency, suggested a peremptory order, that the fate of the province and the war should be decided by a single battle. The Syrians were attached to the standard of Rome and of the cross; but the noble, the citizen, the peasant, were exasperated by the injustice and cruelty of a licentious host, who oppressed them as subjects and despised them as strangers and aliens. A report of these mighty preparations was conveyed to the Saracens in their camp of Emesa, and the chiefs, though resolved to fight, assembled a council. The faith of Abu Obeidah would have expected on the same spot the glory of martyrdom; the wisdom of Khalid advised an honorable retreat to the skirts of Palestine and Arabia, where they might await the succors of their friends, and the attack of the unbelievers. A speedy messenger soon returned from the throne of Medina, with the blessings of Omar and Ali, the prayers of the widows of the Prophet, and a reinforcement of 8,000 Moslems. In their way they overturned a detachment of Greeks, and when they joined at Yarmouk the camp of their brethren, they found the pleasing intelligence that Khalid had already defeated and scattered the Christian Arabs of the tribe of Ghassan. In the neighbourhood of Basra, the springs of Mount Hermon descend in a torrent to the plain of Decapolis, or 10 cities, and the Hieromax, a name which has been corrupted to Yarmouk, is lost, after a short course, in the lake of Tiberias. The banks of this obscure stream were illustrated by a long and bloody encounter. On the momentous occasion, the public voice, and the modesty of Abu Obeidah, restored the command to the most deserving of Moslems. Khalid assumed his station in the front; his colleague was posted in the rear, that the disorder of the fugitive might be checked by his venerable aspect, and the sight of the yellow banner which Mohammed had displayed before the walls of Khaybar. The last line was occupied by the sister of Derar, with the Arabian women who had enlisted in this holy war, who were accustomed to wield the bow and the lance, and who in a moment of captivity had defended, against the uncircumcised ravishers, their chastity and religion. The exhortation of the generals was brief and forcible. "Paradise is before you, the devil and hell fire in your rear." Yet such was the weight of the Roman cavalry that the right wing of the Arabs was broken and separated from the main body. Thrice did they return in disorder, and thrice were they driven back to the charge by the reproaches and blows of the women. In the intervals of action, Abu Obeidah visited the tents of his brethren, prolonged their repose by repeating at once the prayers of 2 different hours, bound up their wounds with his own hands, and administered the comfortable reflection, that the infidels partook of their sufferings without partaking of their reward. 4,030 of the Moslems were buried in the field of battle, and the skill of the Armenian archers enabled 700 to boast that they had lost an eye in that meritorious service. The veterans of the Syrian war acknowledged that it was the hardest and most doubtful of the days which they had seen. But it was likewise the most decisive. Many thousands of the Greeks and Syrians fell by the sword of the Arabs; many were slaughtered, after the defeat, in the woods and mountains; many, by mistaking the ford, were drowned in the waters of the Yarmouk; and, however the loss may be magnified, the Christian writers confess and bewail the bloody punishment of their sins. Manuel, the Roman general, was either killed at Damascus or took refuge in the monastery of Mount Sinai. An exile in the Byzantine court, Jabalah lamented the manners of Arabia, and his unlucky preference of the Christian cause. He had once inclined to the profession of Islam, but in the pilgrimage of Mecca, Jabalah was provoked to strike one of his brethren, and fled with amazement from the stern and equal justice of the Caliph. These victorious Saracens enjoyed at Damascus a month of pleasure and repose; the spoil was divided by the discretion of Abu Obeidah; an equal share was allotted to a soldier and to his horse, and a double portion was reserved for the noble coursers of the Arabian breed. After the battle of Yermuk, the Roman army no longer appeared in the field, and the Saracens might securely choose, among the fortified towns of Syria, the first object of their attack. They consulted the Caliph whether they should march to Caesarea or Jerusalem, and the advice of Ali determined the immediate siege of the latter. To a profane eye, Jerusalem was the first or second capital of Palestine, but after Mecca and Medina, it was revered and visited by the devout Moslems, as the temple of the Holy Land which had been sanctified by the revelation of Moses, of Jesus, and of Mohammed himself. The son of Abu Sophian was sent with 5,000 Arabs to try the first experiment of surprise or treaty, but on the 11th day, the town was invested by the whole force of Abu Obeidah. He addressed the customary summons to the chief commanders and people of Alia. "Health and happiness to every one that follows the right way. We require of you to testify that there is but one God, and that Mohammed is his apostle. If you refuse this, consent to pay tribute, and be under us forthwith. Otherwise I shall bring men against you who love death better than you do the drinking of wine or eating hog's flesh. Nor will I ever stir from you, if it pleases God, till I have destroyed those that fight for you, and made slaves of your children." But the city was defended on every side by deep valleys and steep ascents. Since the invasion of Syria, the walls and towers had been anxiously restored; the bravest of the fugitives of Yermuk had stopped in the nearest place of refuge, and in the defence of the sepulchre of Christ, the natives and strangers might feel some sparks of the enthusiasm which so fiercely glowed in the bosoms of the Saracens. The siege of Jerusalem lasted 4 months; not a day was lost without some action of sally or assault; the military engines incessantly played from the ramparts, and the inclemency of the winter was still more painful and destructive to the Arabs. The Christians yielded at length to the perseverance of the besiegers. The patriarch Sophronius appeared on the walls, and by the voice of an interpreter demanded a conference. After a vain attempt to dissuade the lieutenant of the Caliph from his impious enterprise, he proposed, in the name of the people, a fair capitulation, with this extraordinary clause, that the articles of security should be ratified by the authority and presence of Omar himself. The question was debated in the council of Medina; the sanctity of the place, and the advice of Ali, persuaded the Caliph to gratify the wishes of his soldiers and enemies; and the simplicity of his journey is more illustrious than the royal pageants of vanity and oppression. The conqueror of Persia and Syria was mounted on a red camel, which carried, besides his person, a bag of corn, a bag of dates, a wooden dish, and a leathern bottle of water. Wherever he halted, the company, without distinction, was invited to partake of his homely fare, and the repast was consecrated by the prayer and exhortation of the commander of the faithful. But in this expedition or pilgrimage, his power was exercised in the administration of justice; he reformed the licentious polygamy of the Arabs, relieved the tributaries from extortion and cruelty, and chastised the luxury of the Saracens, by despoiling them of their rich silks, and dragging them on their faces in the dirt. When he came within sight of Jerusalem, the Caliph cried with a loud voice, "God is victorious! O Lord, give us an easy conquest!" and pitching his tent of coarse hair, calmly seated himself on the ground. After signing the capitulation, he entered the city without fear or precaution, and courteously discoursed with the patriarch concerning its religious antiquities. Sophronius bowed before his new master, and secretly muttered, in the words of Daniel, "The abomination of desolation is in the holy place." At the hour of prayer they stood together in the church of the Resurrection, but the Caliph refused to perform his devotions, and contented himself with praying on the steps of the church of Constantine. To the patriarch he disclosed his prudent and honourable motive. "Had I yielded," said Omar, "to your request, the Moslems of a future age would have infringed the treaty under a colour of imitating my example." By his command the ground of the temple of Solomon was prepared for the foundation of a mosque, and during a residence of 10 days, he regulated the present and future state of his Syrian conquests. Medina might be jealous, lest the Caliph should be detained by the sanctity of Jerusalem, or the beauty of Damascus. Her apprehensions were dispelled by his prompt and voluntary return to the tomb of the Apostle. To achieve what yet remained of the Syrian war, the Caliph had formed two separate armies. A chosen detachment, under Amru and Yezid, was left in the camp of Palestine, while the larger division, under the standard of Abu Obadiah and Khalid, marched away to the north against Antioch and Aleppo. The latter of these, the Berea of the Greeks, was not yet illustrious as the capital of a province or a kingdom, and the inhabitants, by anticipating their submission and pleading their poverty, obtained a moderate composition for their lives and religion. But the castles of Aleppo, distinct from the city, stood erect on a lofty artificial mound; the sides were sharpened to a precipice, and faced with freestone, and the breadth of the ditch might be filled with water from the neighbouring springs. After the loss of 3,000 men, the garrison was still equal to the defence, and Youkinna, their valiant and hereditary chief, had murdered his brother, a holy monk, for daring to pronounce the name of peace. In a siege of 4 or 5 months, the hardest of the Syrian war, great numbers of the Saracens were killed and wounded. Their removal to the distance of a mile could not seduce the vigilance of Youkinna, nor could the Christians be terrified by the execution of 300 captives, whom they beheaded before the castle wall. The silence, and at length the complaints, of Abu Obeidah informed the Caliph that their hope and patience were consumed at the foot of this impregnable fortress. "I am variously affected," replied Omar, "by the difference of your success. But I charge you by no means to raise the siege of the castle. Your retreat would diminish the reputation of our arms, and encourage the infidels to fall upon you on all sides. Remain before Aleppo till God shall determine the event, and forage with your horse round the adjacent country." The exhortation of the commander of the faithful was fortified by a supply of volunteers from all the tribes of Arabia, who arrived in camp on their horses or camels. Among these was Dames, of a servile birth, but of gigantic size and intrepid resolution. The 47th day of his service he proposed, with only 30 men, to make an attempt on the castle. The experience and testimony of Khalid recommended his offer, and Abu Obeidah admonished his brethren not to despise the baser origin of Dames, since he himself, could he relinquish the public care, would cheerfully serve under the banner of the slave. His design was covered by the appearance of a retreat, and the camp of the Saracens was pitched about a league from Aleppo. The 30 adventurers lay in ambush at the foot of the hill, and Dames at length succeeded in his inquiries, though he was provoked by the ignorance of his Greek captives. "God curse these dogs!" said the illiterate Arab; "what a strange barbarous language they speak!" At the darkest hour of the night, he scaled the most accessible height, which he had diligently surveyed, a place where the stones were less entire, or the slope less perpendicular, or the guard less vigilant. 7 of the stoutest Saracens mounted on each other's shoulders, and the weight of the column was sustained on the broad and sinewy back of the gigantic slave. The foremost in this painful ascent could grasp and climb the lowest part of the battlements; they silently stabbed and cast down the sentinels, and the 30 brethren, repeating a pious ejaculation, "O Apostle of God, help and deliver us!" were successfully drawn up by the long folds of their turbans. With bold and cautious footsteps, Dames explored the palace of the governor, who celebrated in riotous merriment the festival of his deliverance. From thence, returning to his companions, he assaulted on the inside the entrance of the castle. They overpowered the guard, unbolted the gate, let down the drawbridge, and defended the narrow pass, till the arrival of Khalid, with the dawn of day, relieved their danger and assured their conquest. Youkinna, a formidable foe, became an active and useful proselyte, and the general of the Saracens expressed his regard for the most humble merit, by detaining the army at Aleppo till Dames was cured of his honourable wounds. The capital of Syria was still covered by the castle of Exiles and the iron bridge of the Orontes. After the loss of these important posts, and the defeat of the last of the Roman armies, the luxury of Antioch trembled and obeyed. Her safety was ransomed with 300,000 pieces of gold; but the throne of the successors of Alexander, the seat of the Roman government of the East, which had been decorated by Caesar with the titles of free, and holy, and inviolate, was degraded under the yoke of the caliphs to the secondary rank of a provincial town. In the life of Heraclius, the glories of the Persian war are clouded on either hand by the disgrace and weariness of his more early and his later days. when the successors of Mohammed unsheathed the sword of war and religion, he was astonished at the boundless prospect of toil and danger. His nature was indolent, nor could the infirm and frigid age of the emperor be kindled to a second effort. The sense of shame, and the importunities of the Syrians, prevented the hasty departure from the scene of action; but the hero was no more, and the loss of Damascus and Jerusalem, the bloody fields of Aiznadin and Yermuk, may be imputed in some degree to the absence or misconduct of the sovereign. Instead of defending the sepulchre of Christ, he involved the Church and State in a metaphysical controversy for the unity of his will, and while Heraclius crowned the offspring of his second nuptials, he was tamely stripped of the most valuable part of their inheritance. In the Cathedral of Antioch, in the presence of the bishops, at the foot of the crucifix, he bewailed the sins of the prince and people, but his confession instructed the world, that it was vain, and perhaps impious, to resist the judgment of God. The Saracens were invincible in fact, since they were invincible in opinion, and the desertion of Youkinna, his false repentance and repeated perfidy, might justify the suspicion of the emperor, that he was encompassed by traitors and apostates, who conspired to betray his person and their country to the enemies of Christ. In the hour of adversity, his superstition was agitated by the omens and dreams of a falling crown, and after bidding an eternal farewell to Syria, he secretly embarked with a few attendants, and absolved the faith of his subjects. Constantine, his eldest son, had been stationed with 40,000 men at Caesarea, the civil metropolis of the 3 provinces of Palestine. But his private interest recalled him to the Byzantine court, and after the flight of his father, he felt himself an unequal champion to the united force of the Caliph. His vanguard was boldly attacked by 300 Arabs and 1,000 black slaves, who, in the depth of winter, had climbed the snowy mountains of Libanus, and who were speedily followed by the victorious squadrons of Khalid himself. From the north and south the troops of Antioch and Jerusalem advanced along the seashore till their banners were joined under the walls of the Phoenician cities. Tripoli and Tyre were betrayed, and a fleet of 50,000 transports, which entered without distrust the captive harbours, brought a seasonable supply of arms and provisions to the camp of the Saracens. Their labours were terminated by the unexpected surrender of Caesarea. The Roman prince had embarked in the night, and the defenceless citizens solicited their pardon with an offering of 200,000 pieces of gold. The remainder of the province, Ramla, Ptolemais or Acre, Sichem or Neapolis, Gaza, Ascalon, Berytus, Sidon, Gabala, Laodicea, Apamea, Hierapolis, no longer presumed to dispute the will of the conqueror, and Syria bowed under the sceptre of the Caliphs 700 years after Pompey had despoiled the last of the Macedonian kings. End of chapter 51, part 5.
Chapter 51, Part 6 of the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by M.B. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5, Chapter 51. Conquests by the Arabs, Part 6. The sieges and battles of 6 campaigns had consumed many thousands of the Moslems. They died with the reputation and the cheerfulness of martyrs, and the simplicity of their faith may be expressed in the words of an Arabian youth, when he embraced, for the last time, his sister and mother. "It is not," he said, "the delicacies of Syria, or the fading delights of this world, that have prompted me to devote my life in the cause of religion, but I seek the favour of God and his apostle, and I have heard, from one of the companions of the Prophet, that the spirits of the martyrs will be lodged in the crops of green birds, who shall taste the fruits, and drink of the rivers of paradise. Farewell, we shall meet again among the groves and fountains which God has provided for his elect." The faithful captives might exercise a passive and more arduous resolution; and a cousin of Mahomet is celebrated for refusing, after an abstinence of 3 days, the wine and pork, the only nourishment that was allowed by the malice of the infidels. The frailty of some weaker brethren exasperated the implacable spirit of fanaticism, and the father of Amer deplored in pathetic strains the apostasy and damnation of a son, who had renounced the promises of God and the intercession of the prophet to occupy with the priests and deacons the lowest mansions of hell. The more fortunate Arabs, who survived the war and persevered in their faith, were restrained by their abstemious leader from the abuse of prosperity. After a refreshment of 3 days, Abu Obeidah withdrew his troops from the pernicious contagion of the luxury of Antioch, and assured the Caliph that their religion and virtue could only be preserved by the hard discipline of poverty and labor. But the virtue of Omar, however rigorous to himself, was kind and liberal to his brethren. After a just tribute of praise and thanksgiving, he dropped a tear of compassion, and sitting down on the ground, wrote an answer, in which he mildly censured the severity of his lieutenant. God, said the successor of the Prophet, has not forbidden the use of the good things of this world to faithful men, and such as have performed good works. Therefore you ought to have given them leave to rest themselves and partake freely of those good things which the country affordeth. If any of the Saracens have no family in Arabia, they may marry in Syria, and whosoever of them wants any female slaves, he may purchase as many as he hath occasion for. The conquerors prepared to use, or to abuse, this gracious permission, but the year of their triumph was marked by a mortality of men and cattle, and 25,000 Saracens were snatched away from the possession of Syria. The death of Abu Obeidah might be lamented by the Christians, but his brethren reflected that he was one of the 10 elect whom the Prophet had named as the heirs of paradise. Khaled survived his brethren about 3 years, and the tomb of the Sword of God is shown in the neighbourhood of Emesa. His valour, which founded in Arabia and Syria the empire of the Caliphs, was fortified by the opinion of a special providence, and as long as he wore a cap, which had been blessed by Mohammed, he deemed himself invulnerable amongst the darts of the infidels. The place of the first conquerors was supplied by a new generation of their children and countrymen. Syria became the seat and support of the house of Ommeyah, and the revenue, the soldiers, the ships of their powerful kingdom were consecrated to enlarge on every side the empire of the Caliphs. But the Saracens despise a superfluity of fame, and their historians scarcely condescend to mention the subordinate conquests which are lost in the splendour and rapidity of their victorious career. To the north of Syria they passed Mount Taurus, and reduced to their obedience the province of Cilicia, with its capital Tarsus, the ancient monument of the Assyrian kings. Beyond a second ridge of the same mountains, they spread the flame of war rather than the light of religion, as far as the shores of the Euxine, and the neighbourhood of Constantinople. To the east they advanced to the banks and sources of the Euphrates and Tigris. The long disputed barrier of Rome and Persia was forever confounded. The walls of Edessa and Amida, of Dara and Nisibis, which had resisted the arms and engines of Sapor or Nushirvan, were levelled in the dust, and the holy city of Abgarus might vainly produce the epistle or the image of Christ to an unbelieving conqueror. To the west, the Syrian kingdom is bounded by the sea, and the ruin of Aradus, a small island or peninsula on the east, was postponed during 10 years. But the hills of Libanus abounded in timber. The trade of Phoenicia was populous in mariners, and a fleet of 1,700 barks was equipped and manned by the natives of the desert. The imperial navy of the Romans fled before them and the Pamphylian rocks to the Hellespont. But the spirit of the emperor, a grandson of Heraclius, had been subdued before the combat by a dream and a pun. The Saracens rode masters of the sea, and the islands of Cyprus, Rhodes, and the Cyclades were successively exposed to their rapacious visits. 300 years before the Christian era, the memorable though fruitless siege of Rhodes by Demetrius had furnished that maritime republic with the materials and the subject of a trophy. A gigantic statue of Apollo or the sun, 70 cubits in height, was erected at the entrance of the harbour, a monument of the freedom and the arts of Greece. After standing 56 years, the Colossus of Rhodes was overthrown by an earthquake, but the massy trunk and huge fragments lay scattered 8 centuries on the ground, and are often described as one of the wonders of the ancient world. They were collected by the diligence of the Saracens, and sold to a Jewish merchant of Edessa, who is said to have laden 900 camels with the weight of the brass metal, an enormous weight, though we should include the 100 colossal figures, and the 3,000 statues which adorned the prosperity of the City of the Sun. The conquest of Egypt may be explained by the character of the victorious Saracen, one of the first of his nation, in an age when the meanest of the brethren was exalted above his nature by the spirit of enthusiasm. The birth of Amrou was at once base and illustrious. His mother, a notorious prostitute, was unable to decide among 5 of the Koreish, but the proof of resemblance adjudged the child to Asi, the oldest of her lovers. The youth of Amrou was impelled by the passions and prejudices of his kindred. His poetic genius was exercised in satirical verses against the person and doctrine of Mohammed. His dexterity was employed by the reigning faction to pursue the religious exiles who had taken refuge in the court of the Ethiopian king. Yet he returned from this embassy a secret proselyte. His reason or his interest determined him to renounce the worship of idols. He escaped from Mecca with his friend Khaled, and the Prophet of Medina enjoyed at the same moment the satisfaction of embracing the 2 firmest champions of his cause. The impatience of Amrou to lead the armies of the faithful was checked by the reproof of Omar, who advised him not to seek power and dominion, since he who is a subject today may be a prince tomorrow. Yet his merit was not overlooked by the first 2 successors of Mohammed. They were indebted to his arms for their conquest of Palestine, and in all the battles and sieges of Syria he united with the temper of a chief the valor of an adventurous soldier. In a visit to Medina, the Caliph expressed a wish to survey the sword which had cut down so many Christian warriors. The son of Asi unsheathed a short and ordinary scimitar, and he perceived the surprise of Omar. "Alas," said the modest Saracen, "the sword itself, without the arm of its master, is neither sharper nor more weighty than the sword of Pharezdak the poet." After the conquest of Egypt, he was recalled by the jealousy of the Caliph Othman. His powerful support, both in council and in the field, established the throne of the Ommeyades. The administration and revenue of Egypt were restored by the gratitude of Moawiyah to a faithful friend who had raised himself above the rank of a subject, and Amrou ended his days in the palace and city which he had founded on the banks of the Nile. His dying speech to his children is celebrated by the Arabians as a model of eloquence and wisdom. He deplored the errors of his youth, but if the penitent was still infected by the vanity of a poet, he might exaggerate the venom and mischief of his impious compositions. From his camp in Palestine, Amrou had surprised or anticipated the Caliph's leave for the invasion of Egypt. The magnanimous Omar trusted in his God and his sword, which had shaken the thrones of Chosroes and Caesar. But when he compared the slender force of the Moslems with the greatness of the enterprise, he condemned his own rashness, and listened to his timid companions. The pride and the greatness of Pharaoh were familiar to the readers of the Koran, and a tenfold repetition of prodigies had been scarcely sufficient to effect, not the victory, but the flight of 600,000 of the children of Israel. The cities of Egypt were many and populous. Their architecture was strong and solid. The Nile, with its numerous branches, was alone an insuperable barrier, and the granary of the imperial city would be obstinately defended by the Roman powers. In this perplexity the commander of the faithful resigned himself to the decision of chance, or, in his opinion, of Providence. At the head of only 4,000 Arabs, the intrepid Amrou had marched away from his station of Gaza when he was overtaken by the messenger of Omar. "If you are still in Syria," said the ambiguous mandate, "retreat without delay; but if, at the receipt of this epistle, you have already reached the frontiers of Egypt, advance with confidence, and depend on the succour of God and of your brethren." The experience, perhaps the secret intelligence, of Amrou had taught him to suspect the mutability of courts, and he continued his march till his tents were unquestionably placed on Egyptian ground. He there assembled his officers, broke the seal, perused the epistle, gravely inquired the name and situation of the place, and declared his ready obedience to the commands of the Caliph. After a siege of 30 days, he took possession of Pharma, or Pelusium, and that key of Egypt, as it has been justly named, unlocked the entrance of the country as far as the ruins of Heliopolis and the neighbourhood of the modern Cairo. On the western side of the Nile, at a small distance to the east of the pyramids, at a small distance to the south of the Delta, Memphis, 150 furlongs in circumference, displayed the magnificence of ancient kings. Under the reign of the Ptolemies and Caesars, the seat of government was removed to the sea coast. The ancient capital was eclipsed by the arts and opulence of Alexandria. The palaces, and at length the temples, were reduced to a desolate and ruinous condition. Yet in the age of Augustus, and even in that of Constantine, Memphis was still numbered among the greatest and most populous of the provincial cities. The banks of the Nile, in this place of the breadth of 3,000 feet, were united by 2 bridges of 60 and 30 boats, connected in the middle stream by the small island of Rouda, which was covered with gardens and habitations. The eastern extremity of the bridge was terminated by the town of Babylon, and the camp of a Roman legion, which protected the passage of the river, and the second capital of Egypt. This important fortress, which might fairly be described as a part of Memphis or Misra, was invested by the arms of the lieutenant of Omar. A reinforcement of 4,000 Saracens soon arrived in his camp, and the military engines which battered the walls may be imputed to the art and labour of his Syrian allies. Yet the siege was protracted to 7 months, and the rash invaders were encompassed and threatened by the inundation of the Nile. Their last assault was bold and successful. They passed the ditch, which had been fortified with iron spikes, applied their scaling ladders, entered the fortress with the shout of "God is victorious," and drove the remnant of the Greeks to their boats and the Isle of Rouda. The spot was afterwards recommended to the conqueror by the easy communication with the Gulf and the peninsula of Arabia. The remains of Memphis were deserted. The tents of the Arabs were converted to permanent habitations, and the first mosque was blessed by the presence of 80 companions of Mohammed. A new city arose in their camp, on the eastward bank of the Nile, and the contiguous quarters of Babylon and Phosphat are confounded in their present decay by the appellation of Old Misra, or Cairo, of which they form an extensive suburb. But the name of Cairo, the town of victory, more strictly belongs to the modern capital, which was founded in the 10th century by the Fatimite caliphs. It has gradually receded from the river, but the continuity of buildings may be traced by an attentive eye from the monuments of Sesostris to those of Saladin. Yet the Arabs, after a glorious and profitable enterprise, must have retreated to the desert, had not they found a powerful alliance in the heart of the country. The rapid conquest of Alexandria was assisted by the superstition and revolt of the natives. They abhorred their Persian oppressors, the disciples of the Magi, who had burnt the temples of Egypt and feasted with sacrilegious appetite on the flesh of the god Apis. After a period of 10 centuries, the same revolution was renewed by a similar cause, and in the support of an incomprehensible creed, the zeal of the Coptic Christians was equally ardent. I have already explained the origin and progress of the Monophysite controversy, and the persecution of the emperors, which converted a sect into a nation, and alienated Egypt from their region and government. The Saracens were received as the deliverers of the Jacobite church, and a secret and effectual treaty was opened during the siege of Memphis between a victorious army and a people of slaves. A rich and noble Egyptian of the name of Mokawkas had dissembled his faith to obtain the administration of his province. In the disorders of the Persian war, he aspired to independence. The embassy of Mahomet ranked him among princes, but he declined with rich gifts and ambiguous compliments the proposal of a new religion. The abuse of his trust exposed him to the resentment of Heraclius. His submission was delayed by arrogance and fear, and his conscience was prompted by interest to throw himself on the favor of the nation and the support of the Saracens. In his first conference with Amrou, he heard without indignation the usual option of the Koran, the tribute, or the sword. The Greeks, replied Mokawkas, are determined to abide the determination of the sword. But with the Greeks I desire no communion, either in this world or in the next, and I abjure for ever the Byzantine tyrant, his synod of Chalcedon, and his Melkite slaves. For myself and my brethren, we are resolved to live and die in the profession of the gospel and unity of Christ. It is impossible for us to embrace the revelations of your prophet, but we are desirous of peace, and cheerfully submit to pay tribute and obedience to his temporal successors. The tribute was ascertained at 2 pieces of gold for the head of every Christian, but old men, monks, women, and children of both sexes, under 16 years of age, were exempted from this personal assessment. The Copts above and below Memphis swore allegiance to the Caliph, and promised a hospitable entertainment of 3 days to every Mussulman who should travel through their country. By this charter of security the ecclesiastical and civil tyranny of the Melkites was destroyed. The anathemas of St. Cyril were thundered from every pulpit, and the sacred edifices with the patrimony of the church were restored to the national communion of the Jacobites, who enjoyed without moderation the moment of triumph and revenge. At the pressing summons of Amrou, the patriarch Benjamin emerged from his desert, and after their first interview the courteous Arab affected to declare that he had never conversed with a Christian priest of more innocent manners and a more venerable aspect. In the march from Memphis to Alexandria, the lieutenant of Omar entrusted his safety to the zeal and gratitude of the Egyptians. The roads and bridges were diligently repaired, and in every step of his progress he could depend on a constant supply of provisions and intelligence. The Greeks of Egypt, whose numbers could scarcely equal 1/10 of the natives, were overwhelmed by the universal defection. They had ever been hated, they were no longer feared, the magistrate fled from his tribunal, the bishop from his altar, and the distant garrisons were surprised or starved by the surrounding multitudes. Had not the Nile afforded a safe and ready conveyance to the sea, not an individual could have escaped who by birth or language, or office or religion was connected with their odious name. By the retreat of the Greeks from the provinces of Upper Egypt, a considerable force was collected in the island of Delta. The natural and artificial channels of the Nile afforded a succession of strong and defensible posts, and the road to Alexandria was laboriously cleared by the victory of the Saracens in 22 days of general or partial combat. In their annals of conquest, the siege of Alexandria is perhaps the most arduous and important enterprise. The first trading city in the world was abundantly replenished with the means of subsistence and defense. Her numerous inhabitants fought for the dearest of human rights, religion, and prosperity, and the enmity of the natives seemed to exclude them from the common benefit of peace and toleration. The sea was continually open, and if Heraclius had been awake to the public distress, fresh armies of Romans and barbarians might have been poured into the harbour to save the second capital of the empire. A circumference of 10 miles would have scattered the forces of the Greeks, and favoured the stratagems of an active enemy. But the 2 sides of an oblong square were covered by the sea and the Lake Mareotis, and each of the narrow ends exposed a front of no more than 10 furlongs. The efforts of the Arabs were not inadequate to the difficulty of the attempt, and the value of the prize. From the throne of Medina, the eyes of Omar were fixed on the camp and city. His voice excited to arms the Arabian tribes and the veterans of Syria, and the merit of a holy war was recommended by the peculiar fame and fertility of Egypt. Anxious for the ruin or expulsion of their tyrants, the faithful natives devoted their labors to the service of Amrou. Some sparks of martial spirit were perhaps rekindled by the example of their allies, and the sanguine hopes of Mokawkas had fixed his sepulchre in the church of St. John of Alexandria. Eutychius the patriarch observes, that the Saracens fought with the courage of lions. They repulsed the frequent and almost daily sallies of the besieged, and soon assaulted in their turns the walls and towers of the city. In every attack, the sword, the banner of Amrou, glittered in the van of the Moslems. On a memorable day, he was betrayed by his imprudent valor. His followers who had entered the citadel were driven back, and the general, with a friend and slave, remained a prisoner in the hands of the Christians. When Amrou was conducted before the prefect, he remembered his dignity and forgot his situation. A lofty demeanour and resolute language revealed the lieutenant of the Caliph, and the battle-axe of a soldier was already raised to strike off the head of the audacious captive. His life was saved by the readiness of his slave, who instantly gave his master a blow on the face, and commanded him, with an angry tone, to be silent in the presence of his superiors. The credulous Greek was deceived. He listened to the offer of a treaty, and his prisoners were dismissed, in the hope of a more respectable embassy, till the joyful acclamations of the camp announced the return of their general, and insulted the folly of the infidels. At length, after a siege of 14 months, and the loss of 23,000 men, the Saracens prevailed. The Greeks embarked their dispirited and diminished numbers, and the standard of Mahomet was planted on the walls of the capital of Egypt. "I have taken," said Amrou to the Caliph, "the great city of the West. It is impossible for me to enumerate the variety of its riches and beauty, and I shall content myself with observing, that it contains 4,000 palaces, 4,000 baths, 4,000 theatres or places of amusement, 12,000 shops for the sale of vegetable food, and 40,000 tributary Jews. The town has been subdued by force of arms, without treaty or capitulation, and the Moslems are impatient to seize the fruits of their victory." The commander of the faithful rejected with firmness the idea of pillage, and directed his lieutenant to reserve the wealth and revenue of Alexandria for the public service and the propagation of the faith. The inhabitants were numbered, a tribute was imposed, the zeal and resentment of the Jacobites was curbed, and the Melchites who submitted to the Arabian yoke were indulged in the obscure but tranquil exercise of their worship. The intelligence of this disgraceful and calamitous event afflicted the declining health of the emperor, and Heraclius died of a dropsy about 7 weeks after the loss of Alexandria. Under the minority of his grandson, the clamors of a people, deprived of their daily sustenance, compelled the Byzantine court to undertake the recovery of the capital of Egypt. In the space of 4 years, the harbor and fortifications of Alexandria were twice occupied by a fleet and army of Romans. They were twice expelled by the valor of Amrou, who was recalled by the domestic peril from the distant wars of Tripoli and Nubia. But the facility of this attempt, the repetition of the insult, and the obstinacy of the resistance, provoked him to swear, that if a third time he drove the infidels into the sea, he would render Alexandria as accessible on all sides as the house of a prostitute. Faithful to his promise, he dismantled several parts of the walls and towers, but the people were spared the chastisement of the city, and the Mosque of Mercy was erected on the spot where the victorious general had stopped the fury of his troops. End of chapter 51, part 6.
Chapter 51, Part 2 of the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dick Durrett. Chapter 51 Conquests by the Arabs, Part 2. After the defeat of Cadesia, a country intersected by rivers and canals might have opposed an insuperable barrier to the victorious cavalry, and the walls of Ctesiphon or Maidan, which had resisted the battering rams of the Romans, would not have yielded to the darts of the Saracens. But the flying Persians were overcome by the belief that the last day of their religion and empire was at hand. The strongest posts were abandoned by treachery or cowardice, and the king, with a part of his family and treasures, escaped to Holwan at the foot of the Median hills. In the 3rd month after the battle, Said, the lieutenant of Omar, passed the Tigris without opposition. The capital was taken by assault, and the disorderly resistance of the people gave a keener edge to the sabres of the Moslems, who shouted with religious transport, "This is the white palace of Khosroes. This is the promise of the apostle of God." The naked robbers of the desert were suddenly enriched beyond the measure of their hope or knowledge. Each chamber revealed a new treasure, secreted with art or ostentatiously displayed. The gold and silver, the various wardrobes and precious furniture, surpassed, says Abulfeda, the estimate of fancy or numbers, and another historian defines the untold and almost infinite mass by the fabulous computation of 3,000 of thousands of thousands of pieces of gold. Some minute though curious facts represent the contrast of riches and ignorance. From the remote islands of the Indian Ocean a large provision of camphire had been imported, which is employed with a mixture of wax to illuminate the palaces of the East. Strangers to the name and properties of that odoriferous gum, the Saracens, mistaking it for salt, mingled the camphor in their bread, and were astonished at the bitterness of the taste. One of the apartments of the palace was decorated with a carpet of silk, 60 cubits in length, and as many in breadth. A paradise or garden was depictured on the ground. The flowers, fruits, and shrubs were imitated by the figures of the gold embroidery and the colours of the precious stones, and the ample square was encircled by a variegated and verdant border. The Arabian general persuaded his soldiers to relinquish their claim, in the reasonable hope that the eyes of the Caliph would be delighted with the splendid workmanship of nature and industry. Regardless of the merit of art and the pomp of royalty, the rigid Omar divided the prize among his brethren of Medina. The picture was destroyed, but such was the intrinsic value of the materials that the share of Ali alone was sold for 20,000 drams. A mule that carried away the tiara and cuirass, the belt and the bracelets of Khosroes, was overtaken by the pursuers. The gorgeous trophy was presented to the commander of the faithful, and the gravest of the companions condescended to smile when they beheld the white beard, the hairy arms, and uncouth figure of the veteran who was invested with the spoils of the great king. The sack of Ctesiphon was followed by its desertion and gradual decay. The Saracens disliked the air and situation of the palace, and Omar was advised by his general to remove the seat of government to the western side of the Euphrates. In every age, the foundation and ruin of the Assyrian cities has been easy and rapid. The country is destitute of stone and timber, and the most solid structures are composed of bricks baked in the sun, and joined by a cement of the native bitumen. The name of Cufa describes a habitation of reeds and earth, but the importance of the new capital was supported by the numbers, wealth, and spirit of a colony of veterans, and their licentiousness was indulged by the wisest caliphs, who were apprehensive of provoking the revolt of 100,000 swords. "Ye men of Cufa," said Ali, who solicited their aid, "you have been always conspicuous by your valor. You conquered the Persian king, and scattered his forces till you had taken possession of his inheritance. This mighty conquest was achieved by the battles of Jalula and Nehavend. After the loss of the former, Yezdegerd fled with Holwan, and concealed his shame and despair in the mountains of Farsistan, from whence Cyrus had descended with his equal and valiant companions. The courage of the nation survived that of the monarch. Among the hills to the south of Ecbatana or Hamadan, 150,000 Persians made a third and final stand for their religion and country, and the decisive battle of Nehavend was styled by the Arabs the victory of victories. If it be true that the flying general of the Persians was stopped and overtaken in a crowd of mules and camels laden with honey, the incident, however slight and singular, will denote the luxurious impediments of an Oriental army. The geography of Persia is darkly delineated by the Greeks and Latins, but the most illustrious of her cities appear to be more ancient than the invasion of the Arabs. By the reduction of Hamadan and Isfahan, of Kaswin, Taurus, and Rei, they gradually approached the shores of the Caspian Sea, and the orators of Mecca might applaud the success and spirit of the faithful, who had already lost sight of the northern bear, and had almost transcended the bounds of the habitable world. Again turning towards the west and the Roman Empire, they repassed the Tigris over the bridge of Mosul, and in the captive provinces of Armenia and Mesopotamia embraced their victorious brethren of the Syrian army. From the palace of Maidan, their eastern progress was not less rapid or extensive. They advanced along the Tigris and the Gulf, penetrated through the passes of the mountains into the valley of Estachar or Persepolis, and profaned the last sanctuary of the Magian Empire. The grandson of Chosroes was nearly surprised among the falling columns and mutilated figures, a sad emblem of the past and present future of Persia. He fled with accelerated haste over the desert of Kerman, implored the aid of the warlike Segestans, and sought an humble refuge on the verge of the Turkish and Chinese power. But a victorious army is insensible of fatigue. The Arabs divided their forces in the pursuit of a timorous enemy, and the Caliph Othman promised the government of Khorasan to the first general who should enter that large and populous country, the kingdom of the ancient Bactrians. The condition was accepted, the prize was deserved, the standard of Mahomet was planted on the walls of Herat, Meru, and Balch, and the successful leader neither halted nor reposed till his foaming cavalry had tasted the waters of the Oxus. In the public anarchy, the independent governors of the cities and castles obtained their separate capitulations; the terms were granted or imposed by the esteem, the prudence, or the compassion of the victors; and a simple profession of faith established the distinction between a brother and a slave. After a noble defence, Harmozan, the prince or satrap of Ahwaz and Susa, was compelled to surrender his person and his state to the discretion of the caliph, and their interview exhibits a portrait of the Arabian manners. In the presence and by the command of Omar, the gay barbarian was despoiled of his silken robes embroidered with gold, and of his tiara bedecked with rubies and emeralds. "Are you now sensible," said the conqueror to his native captive, "are you now sensible of the judgment of God, and of the different rewards of infidelity and obedience?" "Alas!" replied Harmozan, "I feel them too deeply. In the days of our common ignorance we fought with the weapons of the flesh, and my nation was superior. God was then neuter. Since he has espoused your quarrel, you have subverted our kingdom and religion." Oppressed by this painful dialogue, the Persian complained of intolerable thirst, but discovered some apprehension lest he should be killed whilst he was drinking a cup of water. "Be of good courage," said the caliph; "your life is safe till you have drunk this water." The crafty satrap accepted the assurance, and instantly dashed the vase against the ground. Omar would have avenged the deceit, but his companions represented the sanctity of an oath, and the speedy conversion of Harmozan entitled him not only to a free pardon, but even to a stipend of 2,000 pieces of gold. The administration of Persia was regulated by an actual survey of the people, the cattle, and the fruits of the earth; and this moment, which attests the vigilance of the caliphs, might have instructed the philosophers of every age. The flight of Yezdegerd had carried him beyond the Oxus, and as far as the Jaxartes, two rivers of ancient and modern renown which descend from the mountains of India towards the Caspian Sea. He was hospitably entertained by Tarkhan, prince of Fargana, a fertile province on the Jaxartes. The king of Samarcand, with the Turkish tribes of Sogdiana and Scythia, were moved by the lamentations and promises of the fallen monarch, and he solicited by a suppliant embassy the more solid and powerful friendship of the emperor of China. The virtuous Taitsong, the first of the dynasty of the Tang, may be justly compared with the Antonines of Rome. His people enjoyed the blessings of prosperity and peace, and his dominion was acknowledged by 44 hordes of the barbarians of Tartary. His last garrisons of Kaskar and Khotan maintained a frequent intercourse with their neighbors of the Jaxartes and Oxus. A recent colony of Persians had introduced into China the astronomy of the Magi, and Taitsong might be alarmed by the rapid progress and dangerous vicinity of the Arabs. The influence, and perhaps the supplies, of China revived the hopes of Yezdegerd and the zeal of the worshippers of fire, and he returned with an army of Turks to conquer the inheritance of his fathers. The fortunate Moslems, without unsheathing their swords, were the spectators of his ruin and death. The grandson of Chosroes was betrayed by his servant, insulted by the seditious inhabitants of Meru, and oppressed defeated and pursued by his barbarian allies. He reached the banks of a river, and offered his rings and bracelets for an instant passage in a miller's boat. Ignorant or insensible of royal distress, the rustic replied that 4 drams of silver were the daily profit of his mill, and that he would not suspend his work unless the loss were repaid. In this moment of hesitation and delay, the last of the Sassanian kings was overtaken and slaughtered by the Turkish cavalry in the 19th year of his unhappy reign. His son Firuz, an humble client of the Chinese emperor, accepted the station of captain of his guards, and the Magian worship was long preserved by a colony of loyal exiles in the province of Bukhara. His grandson inherited the regal name, but after a faint and fruitless enterprise, he returned to China, and ended his days in the palace of Sigan. The male line of the Sassanides was extinct, but the female captives, the daughters of Persia, were given to the conqueror in servitude or marriage, and the race of the caliphs and imams was ennobled by the blood of their royal mothers. After the fall of the Persian kingdom, the river Oxus divided the territories of the Saracens and the Turks. This narrow boundary was soon overleaped by the spirit of the Arabs. The governors of Khorasan extended their successive inroads, and one of their triumphs was adorned with a buskin of a Turkish queen, which she dropped in her precipitate flight beyond the hills of Bokhara. But the final conquest of Transoxiana, as well as of Spain, was reserved for the glorious reign of the inactive Walid, and the name of Qutayba, the camel driver, declares the origin and merit of his successful lieutenant. While one of his colleagues displayed the first Mohammedan banner on the banks of the Indus, the spacious regions between the Oxus, the Jaxartes, and the Caspian Sea were reduced by the arms of Qutayba to the obedience of the Prophet and of the Caliph. A tribute of 2 millions of pieces of gold was imposed on the infidels. Their idols were burnt or broken. The Mussulman chief pronounced a sermon in the new Mosch of Kharizmi. After several battles, the Turkish hordes were driven back to the desert, and the emperors of China solicited the friendship of the victorious Arabs. To their industry, the prosperity of the province, the Sogdiana of the ancients, may in a great measure be ascribed, but the advantages of the soil and climate had been understood and cultivated since the reign of the Macedonian kings. Before the invasion of the Saracens, Kharizmi, Bokhara, and Samarcand were rich and populous under the yoke of the shepherds of the north. These cities were surrounded by a double wall, and the exterior fortification of a larger circumference enclosed the fields and gardens of the adjacent district. The mutual wants of India and Europe were supplied by the diligence of the Sogdian merchants, and the inestimable art of transforming linen into paper had been diffused from the manufacture of Samarcand over the Western world. No sooner had Abu Bekr restored the unity of faith and government than he dispatched a circular letter to the Arabian tribes. In the name of the most merciful God, to the rest of the true believers, health and happiness, and the mercy and blessing of God be upon you. I praise the Most High God, and I pray for his prophet Mohammed. This is to acquaint you that I intend to send the true believers into Syria to take it out of the hands of the infidels, and I would have you know that the fighting for religion is an act of obedience to God. His messengers returned with the tidings of pious and martial ardor, which they had kindled in every province, and the camp of Medina was successively filled with the intrepid bands of the Saracens, who panted for action, complained of the heat of the season and the scarcity of provisions, and accused with impatient murmurs the delays of the Caliph. As soon as their numbers were complete, Abu Bekr ascended the hill, reviewed the men, the horses, and the arms, and poured forth a fervent prayer for the success of their undertaking. In person and on foot he accompanied the first day's march, and when the blushing leaders attempted to dismount, the Caliph removed their scruples by a declaration that those who rode and those who walked in the service of religion were equally meritorious. His instructions to the chief of the Syrian army were inspired by the warlike fanaticism which advances to seize and affects to despise the objects of earthly ambition. "Remember," said the successor of the Prophet, "that you are always in the presence of God, on the verge of death, and in the assurance of judgment and the hope of paradise. Avoid injustice and oppression, consult with your brethren, and study to preserve the love and confidence of your troops. When you fight the battles of the Lord, acquit yourselves like men, without turning your backs, but let not your victory be stained with the blood of women or children. Destroy no palm trees, nor burn any fields of corn. Cut down no fruit trees, nor do any mischief to cattle, only such as you kill to eat. When you make any covenant or article, stand to it, and be as good as your word. As you go on, you will find some religious persons who live retired in monasteries, and propose to themselves to serve God that way. Let them alone, and neither kill them nor destroy their monasteries. And you will find another sort of people that belong to the synagogue of Satan, who have shaven crowns. Be sure you cleave their skulls, and give them no quarter till they either turn Mahometans or pay tribute. All profane or frivolous conversation, all dangerous recollection of ancient quarrels, was severely prohibited among the Arabs. In the tumult of a camp, the exercises of religion were assiduously practised, and the intervals of action were employed in prayer, meditation, and the study of the Koran. The abuse or even the use of wine was chastised by fourscore strokes on the soles of the feet, and in the fervour of their primitive zeal, many secret sinners revealed their fault and solicited their punishment. After some hesitation, the command of the Syrian army was delegated to Abu Obeidah, one of the fugitives of Mecca, and companions of Mahomet, whose zeal and devotion was assuaged without being abated by the singular mildness and benevolence of his temper. But in all the emergencies of war, the soldiers demanded the superior genius of Khaled, and whoever might the choice be of the prince, the sword of God was both in fact and fame the foremost leader of the Saracens. He obeyed without reluctance, he was consulted without jealousy, and such was the spirit of the man, or rather of the times, that Khaled professed his readiness to serve under the banner of the faith, though it were in the hands of a child or an enemy. Glory and riches and dominion were indeed promised to the victorious Mussulman, but he was carefully instructed that if the goods of his life were his only incitement, they likewise would be his only reward. End of chapter 51, part 2. Recording by Dick Durrett, Manchester, New Hampshire.